Okay, so for this third video, uh, since we already talked about a basic introduction to Hegel and his speculative method, now I think it is worth expanding on why exactly he takes this method and or where exactly he starts with the method in order to derive the entire or totality of science as a system. So, to begin, or where Hegel exactly says, or where does Hegel exactly begin? Well, he begins at the beginning, or pure immediacy. And it is this first immediacy that's the starting point where thought cannot assume anything that is logically or thought cannot assume anything before immediacy. So here he actually differs. Or in the past video I mentioned Fichte, that he starts with the I. But the I is, for Hegel, is already a very complex entity that he eventually gets to the point of the I as, or the transcendental unity of apperception, which is something that Kant calls it, is all the way in cognition, which is towards the end of the science of logic. So he doesn't begin with that. He just begins at the beginning, and um, towards the main section of the system in the science of logic. The first section on being is more principally concerned with what in past philosophy has been more concerned with ontology, or really just as the study of being. And he goes through in the section of quality, and goes through this as in conceptually deriving each concept after the next, is more concerned with a radical becoming, or that there is one immediacy that is suddenly opposed by its opposite, and the two vanish into each other, and this vanishing as a self-mediation or a process then becomes the next immediacy, which is then opposed by another, and so on and so forth. And this is particularly true for the section of being, of quality, of quantity, and all the way towards, or quality being basically the determinations of which being can even be considered as a pure being or determinate being, and then being for self or self-mediated being. And then this content is expelled outside itself in the form of pure abstraction of quantity, where you essentially have a quantitative relation between things of determinations of continuity, of discreteness, and intensive degree and extensive magnitudes or extension. And he specifically has more comments about the development of calculus, ratios, etc. And this culminates altogether in the section on measure, where he is specifically concerned with determinations of how quality and quantity are trying to combine and define each other. And essentially, much of the empirical world or empirical science nowadays is principally stuck in what Hegel's determination of measure essentially is, where you conceive of things as a nodal line of measure relations, or an elective affinity, where you have things that are essentially treated purely syntactically in terms of quantity, and then are brought together arbitrarily with a quality or qualities. But both of these determinations are empty. You don't really get at, and this is very summarized, but you don't really eventually get at the point where you have an essential determination of what is. And so from being, you eventually end up at essence. And in this development, the method actually changes, where you no longer have becoming, or the previous process that I mentioned of immediacies that vanish into each other, but we're now at the point where we're no longer concerned, or immediacies don't have any staying power anymore, but mediation is what really stays. And so you have this kind of development from becoming to reflection, where instead of you have a simplex or simple one-sided form, but you actually have two things, or a relation between two things. And this is essentially because you are no longer really considering things in their immediacy. Rather, you're taking the previous surplus and the relation that was previously expelled, right, from the process of becoming. So for reflection, you essentially, everything, if everything in the section of being is unary, then everything in the section of essence is binary. You have a two-sided determination, but each of these, what the two parts that are mediated are pretty much illusory reflections of each other, in the sense that you cannot really abstract one side without losing the other side. You could do this in becoming, because becoming didn't really care about the mediations in the first place. We were still entrenched principally in what was immediacy. But now that we've brought mediation to the forefront, we are working out each of these or reflexive meanings of essence, and essence is essentially in the relation of those things which are mediated. And then you kind of go through this in each section of where he eventually ends up with the identity or abstract identity, A equals A, and then the difference, or everything is different, and then hence opposed to each other, and everything that is in opposition has a positive and negative side, and those positive and negative sides are different, but they're also the same, so they're in contradiction. And then the contradiction itself is a null, but there's also a positive aspect, or positive aspect meaning the contradiction indicates something that is missing, and that missing thing is, or what Hegel calls, the ground, or contradictions themselves must fall to the ground. And in doing so, what grounds things specifically, or there is a condition for ground, or the ground itself, or ground relation is form, and then form, then you have form and essence, form and matter, and then form and content, which then after that you are essentially looking at the conditions that ground the things that exist. And this, you kind of transition from reflection to appearance. And appearance is pretty much concerned where you're looking at the abstract entities of things, But all of those things are interacting and mediating each other in a world of appearance, and then you essentially go through each of these determinations of law and the regularity of law, of what is in stasis or what is in flux, and through this you end up with a crucial idea of the essential relation, or the relation of inner and outer, or that you cannot know something merely as inner without the outer, nor the outer without the inner. Now, this is a very summarized approach. I will go into this in more detail in later articles, but essentially that is what is, or the section of being and the section of essence. And towards the end of essence, you go through the specific determinations of the essential relation between the whole and the parts, and the force and expression, inner and outer, which eventually leads us all the way up to the concept, or the concept that is is itself can be considered as a substance, and as well as a subject. And it is this concept specifically that is pure freedom and pure self-determination, where the subject is trying to recapture and reorganize all the metaphysics that came before it in the sections of being and essence in the concept. And this is essentially the distinction between the first two, which is the objective logic, and the subjective logic that is the end of the concept. But in positing so, we have a method has changed as well. We have a conceptual development between three terms, or you have a universal and a particular and the individual, which you can kind of, there are ways of expressing this categorically, but you can basically think of the universality as a kind of class, or essentially the whole thing in its immediacy, or you can also call the genus or superordinate category. But it contains within it distinctions, divisions, which are the particulars, and those particular things are essentially kind of like subclasses or subkinds. And the whole unity of those distinctions, and as well as the abstract unity, you have the concrete unity, which is itself as an individual, or the individual concept. So every concept has these three sides to it. And previously, this is also connected to the universal, is related to the identity relation of essence. The particular is related to the moment of difference, and the individual is related to the moment of ground. All right, so you have all of these three that are organized as a concept. These concepts themselves can be related to each other in the form of subject and predicate, where you have comparing two things to each other through the copula, or middle term. And this itself is developed into a syllogism, where you have the three parts, or each of the three concepts, and you have a deductive inference, where if you say this is this, and if this is that, then this is that. But the problem with this, or with generally speaking inference in general, this is this act of inference doesn't look at the syllogism in its totality, rather the proof of, or that the syllogism even existed at all was pretty much that you had those two terms, and then since the middle term was the same, they vanished. So you have essentially another determination there, and that's essentially the problem that Hegel is talking about. That if we're not considering the whole syllogism of how each universal, particular, and individual is determined in the whole, and that they're all determined by each other, that is essentially the hallmark of what could be called objectivity, or objectivity as a disjunctive syllogism, where each of the judgments altogether are disjunctively related. And in going through each of these parts, right there, he considers each of the disjunctive syllogism as kind of like Leibniz's monad, where it's kind of a passive object, or it has a kind of syntax of its own. It accepts input, and then it has output. And each of these inputting and outputting things are interacting with each other, right? And they form a whole mechanistic system. But in mechanism, each of these things are only passively related to each other. There's no mutual striving towards each other. And this is where Hegel develops the concept of chemism instead of mechanism. And chemism is essentially carries with it the notion of, mainly referring to chemistry, but it's not specifically just about chemistry. It's things which are implicitly related in striving towards each other, in the same way that in chemical reactions things tend to combine with each other and then break apart. And there is something that is internal or intrinsic to the object that makes it do this, then it is externally determined, like in a mechanistic deterministic universe where one thing collides with another thing and that thing bounces off, and you have a bunch of atomistic things or parts in a machine that kind of interact with each other in that way. But in the culmination of this, of mechanism and chemism, you have teleology. And teleology is essentially a unity of striving and stasis, where you have something that is posited as a subjective end, or the goal of something, and then there is a means of achieving that goal, so that it is directed towards that, and then the goal itself is achieved. And this is self-determinacy. So this self-determinacy of ends, or everything being an end, you essentially have a subjective determination and an objective determination combine into one unity. And that unity for Hegel is the idea. And this idea goes through its own stages of immediacy as life. So you have life forms, which are a kind of syllogism of syllogisms, where each of these parts are kind of self-determined, and you have the soul and you have the body that make up the organism, and the organism itself possesses the functions of sensibility, that's universal, being able to sense things, but also irritability or irritation, which is sort of like muscle movement, action, to be able to have a reaction to the environment. And in doing so, we reproduce ourselves or maintain, or the organism maintains what it is through these functions. And the organism essentially goes through each of these stages, and the culmination of which is where the organism essentially has a way of reproducing itself, or actually genuine, reproduction or replication, where life continues on in the offspring of other organisms, and this life process of or the genus of life, which encompasses all its individuals, or the mediation between life forms, that is essentially cognition, right? Because cognition is a mediation between the perceiver and what is perceived, right? And towards the end of the logic, Hegel specifically goes through the moments of cognition, of the analytic side that is concerned with the theoretical idea of cognition, at least that of which is described by Kant and Fichte, which faces or a synthetic mode of cognition, which comes up with definitions and classifications, divisions, to the point where it has a theory of reality, or specific determined theory, which is itself realized or proven in the practical activity, or essentially what we do with that theory. But eventually the theoretical and the practical, or what is called the true and the good, eventually self-erase, and this self-erasure in their unity is the absolute idea. And the absolute idea is the entire system of our science of logic as a whole, where you essentially have the whole system of each being three, and then three within threes, or a syllogism of syllogisms. But the main form of the syllogism replicates what originally came before, of the three parts of immediacy, mediation, and then self-mediation. So we've essentially arrived back at the beginning, or when we consider the whole thing as in its immediacy, we can go back to the starting point, which is immediacy. And this, in general, was a very abridged overview to the science of logic. And I'm going to produce future videos like this, going in more detail, hopefully, but this is just a very, or at least the past three videos are just an introduction to Hegel, and I hope this has been very informative. Thank you.